Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm going to go through chapter 10 of this book with you this evening. It's late here in the UK, but I'm going to try and finish this chapter up. It's a shorter chapter, so hopefully we can get it done before we have the final two chapters to do before tomorrow when we meet our friend, the author of this book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity. So far, we've been looking at points of differences between certain Deobandi ulama and the Barelvi ulama, in particular Ahmed Raza Khān. However, there were also points of convergence. There were places at points where the Barelvis and the Deobandis had similarities, or they had affinities, or at least they shared similar concerns as well. Okay, and so we need to sort of understand what is bid'ah according to Ahmed Raza Khān, and how did he imagine transgression? What was his notion of reform? So we've talked extensively of how Deobandis understood reform, and what did he find objectionable in the everyday lives of the masses, and why. Okay, and when you read his works, it's clear that at certain points he was even more critical of rituals and customs, rusu, than the Deobandis themselves. So at certain points, he spoke out more vehemently in terms of criticism of practices within the community as opposed to Deobandis as well. Now, it's also worth remembering that when we look at the differences that he had with the Deobandis, there were very much hermeneutical differences of how you understand text, how you understand words and their meanings and the implication as well. Ahmed Raza Khān was also, like many Deobandis, invested in securing and guarding the purity of the Muslim identity against what he felt were corruptions. And this is very similar to what Deobandis were doing, in fact. So what you often find is, while there were some important differences, there was a lot of times where there were similar concerns that he had with Deobandi scholars as well. So, moreover, such as much as we can talk about differences, there were also similarities in his efforts to regulate the religious lives of the masses. And a lot of the time, this was gendered. This was to do with gender, women. So they talked particularly about women who they felt were sites of reform in particular as well. And he had a less than charitable view of the ability of the common folk, of the awam, to abstain from transgression. And this was something very similar that the Deobandis also felt, that the masses essentially could not be trusted in terms of managing their limits in terms of transgression. So we have many examples of how Ahmed Raza Khān would reform people. So, for example, as an example in the book of how he was asked a question once, where when someone dies, people stay at their home for like 40 days and eating food at their house and enjoying themselves. And he found this really problematic. And he spoke out quite vehemently against it. He said, how can this be normatively possible, right? Rather, what you should be doing is feeding that person who's experienced a death in their house, but you're staying there and you're benefiting from them and causing them difficulties. So this is something that Deobandi would have found equally problematic as well. Certain customs, innovations that would have come from some other practice that was not religious, and become part of people's rusum, people's customs, and almost have taken a hue identity of becoming something religious. And so Ahmed Raza Khān, for example, spoke up against these things. Also, in other places, he had what's the idea of conditional salvation. So, while he was flexible in certain issues compared to Deobandis, he was less flexible when it came to things to do with religious identity, in terms of people who could receive food, or the souls who could benefit from its distribution. If you remember, they would make food on certain dates to remember deceased people and to hopefully give them reward as a consequence of it. And so for him, it was only the soul of a Muslim who had not contravened the necessities of religion who could attain the blessings reaped from an act of charity. right? And so you had to be a Muslim, right? You had to be a good practicing Muslim to get the rewards for the idea of the tabarruk, to get the blessings of the food as well. So even like the food I was giving away to charity, he would say you can't even give that to non-Muslims. It has to be given to Muslims, right? How can there be an act of charity if you're giving the food away to Muslims? So he spoke up against many customs, and so there was a lot of affinity. There was a lot of overlap between the Barelwis, Ahmad Raza Khan, and many of the Deobandi scholars as well. And uh, that's often misunderstood, misapplied, and people don't often see this. Of course, throughout the book, we've been pointing at differences. We've been looking at how they understood bid'ah, but there's also many places where there were similarities as well. He was also very keen, like the Deobandis, to maintain the public distinction between Muslims and Hindus, right? Just like the Deobandis, they were particularly concerned with tashabbuh, imitating non-Muslims in identity, in other practices. Ahmad Raza Khan had a similar concern in terms of maintaining Muslim identity in the public sphere as well. So this Sha'a'ir Islam, this idea of maintaining the the identity of Islam, right? These religious this distinction of Muslimness was very important to him, just like it was important to the Deobandis, right? So what we see in Ahmad Razan Khan's views on others is that it evades this conceptualization of seeing Muslims, as we see with the Deobandis and with Barelwis, as seeing them as like one camp is Sufi and one other camp is particularly scholarly, but actually it's very complicated as well, right? So you can't just say, one camp was peaceful and another camp was violent. One was reformist, one was non-reformist. It's actually very much more complicated, and you have to really engage with this tradition. This is why I have a particular problem when people engage in these polemics, sectarianism, without actually understanding what it was all about, right? And we've spent a lot of time going through the chapters, almost 300 pages of discussion. And, one needs to be really well trained in the primary sources and in terms of engaging with their works in particular as well. And just like the Deobandis, again, another similarity was just like the Deobandis were very much fixated with regulating everyday life, right? Those of us who follow this tradition in the West will know that there's a lot of focus on regulating everyday life. And for Ahmad Raza Khan, it was very similar. So practices like flying kites, playing chess, playing cards, quail and chicken fighting contests, hunting animals, all of these things he spoke out against as well, because these were things that were wasting time. And he obviously had a difference in the sense that in his normative imaginary, it was not enough to legally prohibit an act by declaring it forbidden. Legal prohibition had to be accompanied by a public display of effective displeasure. So sometimes he went a step further than the Deobandis. So while the Deobandis might have said, we don't want to do X, Y, and Z because it's problematic based on our understanding of bid'ah, he actually, Ahmad Raza Khan at times would go further and say, never mind saying that we're not going to do it, never mind saying it's forbidden, you have to publicly show your displeasure at that act as well, right? So he was very much invested, just like the Deobandis, in reforming society, reforming the community. He was well invest. He was trying to reform as well. Um, and so extravagance, frivolity, um, using time or wasting your time in non-essential purposes like sports entertainment was problematic for him. And this has overlaps with the Deobandis, because in their discourse there was this idea of simplicity and not extravagance in weddings and so forth as well. And just like Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanwi, right, just like Ashraf Ali Tanwi, Ahmad Raza Khan, they shared something very common in terms of, they had this visceral condemnation for wedding ceremonies, extravagant wedding ceremonies, and the book talks about this as well. So again, they were very similar in sort of the concerns that they had as well. And in some ways, Ahmad Raza Khan would also use gender, bring gender in and class in as well. So he would talk about, as mentioned in the book, how he would castigate people for mixing with the lower castes, or he wanted women who had a higher class not to mix with women who, especially at weddings and stuff, because that would bring their nobility down, right? So he even felt that weddings were part of socio-economic decay, right? Getting involved in weddings where people of lower class are there, women who are of such sort of lesser reputation were there, would somehow corrupt the women of nobility, right? And he talks about this as well. So this is something to bear in mind as well, and again sharing affinities with Deobandi idea of reform as well. Um, and so he there was also differences in terms of how they understood reform, as we've said. The central objective, that Ahmad Raza Khan did not have a program of religious and moral reform, right? And he did, just like the Deobandis, he did have a program of reforming society as well. And so seeing like Deobandis and Barelwis as like Deobandis were into reform and somehow Ahmad Raza Khan was against reform is highly problematic. They were both involved in their own ways of reforming society as well. So despite their intense disagreements, um, they both shared the idea that reforming the masses was an urgent imperative. This was something that was really, really important that needed to be done as well. So while they may have both been critical, on the other hand, of social practices and customs like weddings, there were also differences as well, right? For Khan, a community's imagination of moral good is largely reflected divine will. So for Ahmad Raza Khan, he felt, and this kind of like relates to what we said about Shah Waliullah, that um, society did to a certain extent know what was right and what was good. Okay, there were certain habits in society which were good, and that did not explicitly oppose the Sharia as well. Um, and so you didn't, the ulama didn't always have to the ulama didn't always have to get involved in these things. That was for him. So he was more of a minimalist in this way as well. However, for the Deobandis, um, reform was about transformation, not continuity. So they had to transform society. Whereas for Ahmad Raza Khan in particular, it was more about continuity of practices from before while removing anything that was problematic. Whereas for Deobandis, it was much more about transformation than continuity. Okay. So for Ahmad Raza Khan in his discourse is very clear that he was about preservation of authorized traditions, okay, and not reinventing the wheel. And he argued that the Deobandis were overzealous, okay, and they were excessive, and sometimes their concerns were misplaced as well. So the real important part in this chapter comes here, where he says that Ahmad Raza Khan and the Deobandi and his Deobandis opponents, well, there was a very subtle disagreement. So it wasn't a big disagreement; it was a very subtle disagreement over what should one do when simply permissible practices that serve as a means to honor the Prophet, peace be upon him, become corrupted by the manner in which the masses engage with them. Right. So something that's permissible, if it becomes corrupted, what do we do? Right. What's our approach? And this is where the disagreement really lies in. Right. These are otherwise permissible activities. If something happens in those activities which becomes problematic, what's our response? So, as you know, for the Deobandis, it was a different way. For Ahmad Raza Khan, there was a different approach. And this is where they diverged. But they both understood that there was corrupt practices. There were things that need reforming as well. So, in the case of Ahmad Raza Khan, for example, rather than condemning the practice altogether, scholars should try and correct and reform any corrupt practices that were part of it. So we don't want to get rid of it. What we need to do is sort of remedy those issues, to sort out those issues. Um, so one could not outlaw practices that exalted the honor of the Prophet, or served any other pious purposes. Don't outlaw the whole thing. Don't throw the whole, baby out with the bathwater, right? Reform it. Try and sort the problem out. On the other hand, in the view of the Deobandi scholars that we've discussed, um, it was anything that was a palpable threat to divine sovereignty that took precedence. So, if any act which was corruptive was a threat to God, to the sovereignty of God, or that would then need to be removed because that took priority or over venerating the Prophet. So, divine sovereignty was much more important to them as well, protecting divine sovereignty or any other non-obligatory expression of piety. In other words, if there was something corrupt in society, in other practice, and no matter how good the intent was, we need to remove it because we can't risk damaging or compromising divine sovereignty as well. Okay, and this was the only viable option, which was we need to outlaw the practice. So they would say we outlaw the practice because that's too much of a risk for us to take. And Ahmed Raza Khān would say, no, no, what we do is we try and reform them. So can you see the differences on? It's a difference of approach, right? It's a difference of approach. How do we approach a problematic issue, which in otherwise it's a perfectly legitimate action. The Mawlid is a perfectly legitimate action for both of them, for the Barelwis and the Deobandis, right? But when there's corruptive influences, one would say, well, let's try and remove those corruptive influences. Another would say, well, let's just ban the whole thing altogether as well. So this was a subtle hermeneutical disagreement, and you can't just say, this is a disagreement between people who follow the law and people who are Sufis. Right? It's much more complicated than that, and so you can't use these binaries of moderate, conservative, reform, anti-reform, rigid or flexible. It was much more complicated than that as well. So I hope that's been made clear as well. I think that's a really important discussion to make, and this comes through a lot of reading. In this book, we've spent 300 pages just going through line by line these discussions as well. And so I want to sort of leave it there. The next chapter, we've got 2 more chapters. The next chapter is a very important disagreement that happens between the Deobandis and the Barelwis, and this is the only one that we haven't covered, and you probably know which one it's going to be because we've covered the Mawlid, we've covered Bid'ah, we've covered the discussion around can God lie, we've covered the discussion around can God create another prophet like the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We've covered a lot of these things, and the one that's left now is the Prophet's capacity for knowledge of the unknown, right? Ilmul Ghaib. This is something that's very, very contentious. Again, these are scholarly discussions, right? So people like me and you, we don't really understand the complexities of it all, really. I mean, I don't understand it myself, to be honest, and I'm just a normal person on the street. But it is important to be aware of these things and to realize that actually a lot of these differences were academic, they were very subtle, and to people like me, it's not really that relevant in the grand scheme of things. But it's important to know that they had a lot of things in common as well. And there's a context in which Barelwi and Deobandi polemics emerge as well. So this has been a slightly shorter lecture video. In the next video, inshallah, I'm going to cover chapter 11, and then we're going to finish off with chapter 12, and we'll take it from there. Stay safe. I'll see you all soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.